You're listening to Barbell Logic,
the podcast where we talk about what it means to experience strength
and how you can use simple, hard, and effective strategies in training and nutrition to improve your life.
It starts with meeting you where you are right now and finding lasting solutions.
Welcome to the show.
Hey everybody, welcome to the Barbell Logic podcast. I'm your host, Niki Sims. With me is Andrew Jackson.
Hello.
Hello.
In person, round two.
Yes, we keep
Ready.
getting... Yes, welcome to the battle.
Warning, this is coffee number 3 of the day.
Oh, dear Lord.
Yes.
Okay, good luck to all of us. This is coffee number 2, so I've got probably a good 20 minutes before I'm starving and have a panic attack.
That sounds about right. Well, we're about to talk about deadlifts, so I just wanted to get completely caffeinated out of my mind.
Should we do some nose twerk? Should we put our lifting belts on to talk about this?
Yes, that would be fun, actually. We should do an episode where we put on full competition gear, knee sleeves,
Singlets,
belt, wrist wraps, shoes, chalk, and just snort ammonia
see what
happens.
That one you will have to watch on video.
Oh, and we should have done it for this one, I suppose, but taking shots of whiskey right before your deadlift and eating Skittles. So you just get hyped up on sugar, alcohol, and caffeine and ammonia.
This is the podcast about health. Welcome to the health show.
Health.
Health, H-E-L-T-H. Yes. But yeah, we really did want to talk about the deadlift because we know it matters a lot to you, matters a lot to us. And it's one of those lifts that, like, the setup and execution is simple, definitely hard lift to execute.
Yeah.
But there are many ways you can get the bar from point A to point B in a deadlift. It's a little bit more forgiving than a squat.
In some ways.
I
think, well, first off, backing up, we got a lot of good feedback about our kind of technical deep dive on the squat.
Yep.
So that's what this episode is, I think, geared towards.
Yes.
Deconstructing the deadlift technically, talking about margin for error, or what did you say?
I think you can get away with more slop on a deadlift than you can on a squat, assuming you're like taking a squat to depth.
Slop.
You can
Define slop for me.
You can pull the deadlift and it will make someone who's watching, it will make them cringe.
Okay.
Lots of us have maybe watched some YouTubes of some pretty heinous deadlifts, and you can still get the bar from point A to point B. You can hitch, you can round your back, you can do a bunch of stuff on a squat.
Yeah.
I mean, certainly both. Like
squat morning the hell out of some ugly ass squats.
Yeah, that was most of my squat training for sure. But the deadlift tends to be, you can lift more weight in an uglier way than the squat, I think.
Yeah, I mean, maybe the thought that is coming up for me in terms of margin for error is that because it's generally for most people, although once you get to a certain level of strength, often the squat becomes the heavier lift. Like if you look at super heavyweights, it's pretty rare to see somebody deadlifting more than they squat.
Do you think that's because of their body type?
I think it's because you get the stretch reflex. And so at some point, the ability to bounce out of the bottom enables you to lift more. And some of it might be body type, but it's pretty common when you get to the elite level that the deadlift and the squat are pretty comparable, unless you have a deadlift specialist who's got, proportions that are favorable to the deadlift. But in terms of pure strength, it's kind of interesting if you look at the numbers. But for most people, and even at elite levels, often the deadlift is the biggest deadlift, certainly. I'm thinking mostly super heavyweights.
Yeah.
Like the strongest of the strong people.
Yeah.
Are
people moving the most weights.
Usually squatting more, or at least comparable. Anyways, for most people, it's the heaviest. For the average person, it's the heaviest usually by a lot. And when you say margin for error, I often think about where the deadlift will fail is because of a pretty small margin of error, often in bar path. Like if that bar, that bar.
Yeah, same. And if
I hate that bar. But if the
that
bar
with our knees and bar goes that way, we really need to bring our knees back.
If the bar comes off those shins, if the bar pops off the shins, even like half an inch, an inch, sometimes really that can just kill a lift. So in some ways, I would agree with you that you'll see maybe a little bit more deviation, but I think it's still to execute a true 1RM, you got to be pretty on point.
I'm not saying it doesn't matter about your form.
Okay.
Definitely does.
Okay. I thought you said grip it and rip it.
I mean, that's the mentality often. But you need to train so that when you grip it and rip it, you actually are setting yourself up for the most success because you have all your stuff together.
Okay. Fair point. So what are you finding yourself working on with lifters to address that tendency to look like a cat and
to not look like it? Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, the largest error that we end up dealing with, especially when things get really heavy, is the problem that the body solves of trying to get the hips closer to the bar. To finish the deadlift, your hips need to come to extension, knees need to come to extension, and
those knees,
these knees, our knees, global knees. And your hips can get closer to the bar by bringing the weight up and getting closer to the bar with back extension, or the hips can't get closer to the bar by the back rounding. And so if you haven't really developed the strength and awareness of what that feels like, it's hard to know if you're actually maintaining extension by bringing hips to the bar. So that's like a tough part of the body part to have proprioceptive awareness too. So doing a lot of reps in training where that part of the back stays in extension. Really,
which part of the back?
The lower back.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you. And so when your back rounds and you're doing deadlifts, you're not training the muscles that you need to maintain extension. And when you get to a heavy lift and your back starts rounding, it's definitely more of a toss-up if you're going to finish the lift or not.
Why?
Because you've essentially run out of knee extension, hip extension, and the only thing you have left to save you are your erectors. And I have erected my way out of many a deadlift, but
right.
There's not a long lifespan with that, in the sense of like, yeah, your spine might get, it's not always an injury, but it's like, it's a strain, it's a strain on the muscles. So
sure.
That part of your back doesn't recover very well. It can eat into your training. And also you may just not get very much more weight on the bar over time because you're not using the bigger, stronger muscle groups and just relying on this one chunk of muscles. So developing the strength of the erectors and, like we talked about in the squat, like what it means to actually brace the full circumference around the spine, not just back there in your erectors.
So what are some cues or techniques that you work with your lifters to build that awareness and build that capacity to maintain lumbar in a relatively neutral position?
The main cues I use are knees out.
In the setup position.
Yeah. And sometimes while they're lifting too, because knees out, that cue tries to, or the idea of that cue is to elicit external rotation of the femur. And when you externally rotate the femur, you're contracting the glutes. You're bringing the origin of the glutes along the pelvis and the insertion along the femur closer to each other. And in doing that, you actually flatten the lower back a bit more, and it gives you some room to like feel a lot more extension, and you start to feel your legs. I want you to feel the deadlift in your legs.
Yep.
So knees out is a really useful one.
Also brings the hips closer to the bar.
Totally. Yeah, you're taking out some slop there.
And bringing in your adductors more into the lift, bringing in more muscle mass.
Yes.
That is contributing to hip extension as well.
Yeah, hip adductors are definitely hip extensors. And then one that I really like is bringing your lats to your triceps. Kind of shortens the armpit.
Okay.
I'm trying to get the lifter to have the most closed angle at the armpit as I can get them to have without dropping their hips and rolling the bar forward.
Why is that?
Or going into overextension. So having the lats squeezed is another way to start working on getting the hips towards the bar. It's another way to get upper back extension. And the lats are really the big meat of muscle that's connecting you to the bar through your arms. Like the shoulder muscles are many, and that's obviously important, but the lats are the big meat that connect your back to your arms to the bar.
Right. The insertion of the lat is about, an inch or two down the humerus. So it's in the arm, the humerus through your hands is what's connecting the sort of drivetrain, transferring the legs and your knee and your hip extensors to the bar. So I like that cue because that's keeping that power train tight and efficient.
Yeah.
And avoiding the arm swinging away.
Yeah. because that can be death in a deadlift when the bar swings out. So much about the deadlift is feeling like you're able to take on the weight of the bar when you start to move it. In the squat, you unrack it and you're like, I have the weight now.
Right.
There's no...
You're cultivating tension as you
there's a bunch of compression.
Descend.
Yeah. And then you create the tension as you move. But with the deadlift, you go from just creating contraction, muscular tension kind of on your own. Then you have to start to take on the weight of the bar.
Right.
And the more you can do that and get rid of the slack that occurs between the bar and the plates, between your hand and the bar, and then between all the compressive tissue in your body, the more you're going to be able to take on the weight of the bar and have to go through less of that kind of yanking and the slop.
It's the voluntary hardship of lifts.
Yeah.
Because the squat, you let the weight, well, you don't let it, but the weight participates in helping you build tension as you descend. The force of gravity is squishing you into the bottom, and you're almost resisting that as you descend, and you can use it to your advantage. Deadlift, it's all on you to generate all of that tension as you're, to your point, picking up more and more load, and depending on how much weight you have on the bar, you're starting to peel the inner plates off the floor before the outer plates. And so it's dynamic. The load feels different in your hands and on your body as you're voluntarily creating all of that tension.
And the hardest part is at the beginning.
Right. And so as that load is changing, or the perception of that load is changing in your hands and on your body, you have to keep fighting to maintain those positions that you're talking about with your lats and your knees out. You've got to, as we cue, squeeze the slack out of the bar, still fight to hold all those positions, which is challenging.
And not just let your back go.
Not get pulled out of position.
That's the easiest solution at the time when the lift is hardest. But if you have a slow lockout, if you have a fast off the floor and a slow lockout, take a look at what your back looks like. It's often that your back is not in extension by the time you get to the lockout.
Yep.
Yeah.
Now, there's, I think, a difference between using the deadlift to train, to include training your back and your ability to set your back and hold your back, and going for an absolute lifetime all-out 1RM with respect to your upper back. Because as you said, part of the problem that the body is trying to solve is getting the hips closer to the bar. And I do think there is some wiggle room with how hard you set your upper back. And even at a certain point, when it gets heavy enough, I just don't think maintaining, quote unquote, perfect thoracic extension is even possible for a full-on legit 1RM. Now, some people might have the anthropometry to be able to do that, but I think with any kind of length in your torso, it's going to go.
Yeah.
And you see that with a lot of elite powerlifters. They're doing that intentionally.
Right. Because they're trying to get their shoulders closer to their hips.
And it also allows the hips to squeeze a little bit closer to the bar. So you're getting a more efficient pull, and you're able to actually set your back at a little bit more vertical angle because you're rounding your upper back. All of that said, for the purpose of training, if our goal is general strength training and quality of life, I agree that aiming to set your back in that as much of a quote unquote neutral spine position. There's always going to be movement in the spine under heavy load. So I would put it out there to people to relax a little bit about thinking that you're going to maintain a perfect somehow spine. I mean, the spine is going to move. It's just the way it is. But the goal is to train those muscles.
Yeah.
And so I do agree with a lot of those cues. And jumping back to your knees out cue, I often talk about the knees as you're initiating the lift and breaking the plates off the floor as sort of the equivalent in the squat as you're coming up out of the bottom, and the tendency for your knees to shoot back in a squat can also, I see often with lifters that don't have particularly a lot of distal quadricep development. They will shoot the knees back. They'll cave in and shoot back because their quads, essentially, my theory is they aren't strong enough to push the weight through that initial part of the lift. So they're loading up the hips. They lose their back angle. So their back flattens out, and then they just freaking muscle that sucker up. It's like the equivalent of the squat morning.
Totally.
You see the same thing on the deadlift. And I do think knees out can kind of help battle that, or at least I'm trying to coach my lifters to train the muscles to be able to stay out, keep the knees forward, and get to a point where the hips and the knees are working together as much as possible, as early as possible, so that you avoid sort of the two-part lift. Have you seen those deadlifts
really
where it's like the knees shoot back, the bar doesn't really move, it breaks off the floor, and then it gets kind of stuck until they get it high enough that the hips can just take over, and then you get this kind of the back
sometimes
swing.
even the knees are still bent when they come under the bar.
Yeah, a little
You're
bit.
like, okay,
sometimes.
now I'll put my knees
now
back
I
in the
can
game.
get it.
Get my
So you
quads
get
back
sort
in
of
the
that
game.
double clutch at the top.
Yeah.
And then the trifecta is if they haven't set their back, then they also then have to, sometimes they use that knee bend to hitch. And that's where, if you're hitching at the top, I would also suggest going back to look at your setup, because often the hitch is a workaround to temporarily unload your spine so you can straighten it out.
When you're doing a hitch, what you're doing is you're actually putting the weight onto your quads.
Yes.
And then you, like a really exaggerated hitch, and this is allowed in like strongman competition, you'll see them like jump the weight up. Basically, like your knees really should be extended at that point. But at this point in a hitch, your knees are probably not extended.
Or they'll rebend them.
Or they'll rebend them. The weight's resting on your quads, and you kind of basically just do whatever you can to squeeze yourself into a standing position.
Yeah, I think there's
sometimes the bar moves down instead of up.
I think there's the intentional hitch where you're kind of like trying to bounce it up.
Yeah.
And then there's the one that creeps in if somebody hasn't set their back, where they're just kind of like subconsciously solving that problem of like, okay, crap, how am I going to extend my back when all I have is my erectors?
Right.
No moment arm, like the worst possible leverage, and these long ropey muscles that aren't really trained usually for
like hundreds of pounds,
massive contraction. So the hitch becomes that little relief. It's like, oop, now I can sneak into spinal extension, and now I can finish the lift.
Yeah. The biggest thing that you have to conquer is, well, it helps to understand that the spine is a series of joints. There are so many joints. So it's much more doable to be like, okay, well, there's the knee joint and the hip joint, like super simple. But the spine is such a long series of joints. And you have many muscles that insert and originate in each vertebrae. And it even changes along the course up the spine. Some of it's your lats, some of it's your rhomboids, some of it's your traps. And so it's a really complex bony structure that you have to try and keep in a single position so that it acts one bone, but really it's not.
I, over the last couple of years, I think as I've talked about, have been struggling with some back symptoms, if you will. I have no idea what it is. Never got imaging. I have theories, but anyways. And it has offered me an opportunity to revisit how I set my back. And one of the things that I've changed my perspective on is what it feels like, or what I focus on in order to set my back. Most of my lifting history, I was really concentrated on the idea of getting my chest up, almost arching my back. And often,
you would,
when I go back and look at my old videos, I think I was effectively overextending my lumbar. And I see this with clients as well that emphasize lifting your chest up a lot, or, sometimes we'll use the cue to create a bowl with your back, which these are things that do work for somebody who literally doesn't know how to extend their back. And they have to sort of over-exaggerate that, which, like we've talked about before, often cues are not the actual model. They're ideas that you're trying to put in somebody's head to get them to move in a certain way. So if somebody's setting up for their deadlift and completely rounded over, you might need to give them a cue that says chest up or arch your back, or, imagine creating a bowl with your back just to get them to neutral. But for me, I think I started over-exaggerating that. And so you'd see in looking at old videos a tendency to overextend. And then as that load that we were talking about came onto my body, it would kind of pull into a more neutral position because I couldn't hold overextension. Like we talked about in the squat, I don't think you can hold overextension as you go into the bottom of the squat. I don't think you can do it with a sufficiently heavy load on a deadlift either. And then I would be fighting against that the whole time, thinking that I was rounding my back. So I was fighting to get back into overextension through the lift and
sometimes you would finish your deadlift with
almost chest up. Yeah, exactly.
I would see you go into more extension on the way up.
Right. And similar to other cues we've talked about where the cue has good intention, but if you take it literally or too far, that puts you actually in a disadvantage. I've actually had to rethink, and I've been working with a lot of lifters on this as well, to focus more on the anterior side of the body as a means of setting your back as much as I am the posterior. Specifically, it occurred to me as I was working through these ideas with my lift that there's a ton of meat on the anterior side of my spine that I just wasn't even thinking of. I mean, I'm sure as I was taking a breath and setting my Valsalva, there was some obviously contraction of my abs and that sort of thing. But I've found recently, working with my clients and myself, that as much as I want to think about contracting the spinal erectors and setting my back, I'm less interested in thinking of it as arching my back or squeezing my chest up as I am wrapping my spine with as much muscle as I can. Almost three-dimensional. I imagine my spine resting on a bed of muscle on the anterior side and then also being like gripped by the posterior side with my spinal erectors. And it's this image of all of the muscle like grabbing onto the spine three-dimensionally, almost like the cue, eat the bar with your back.
Oh, that's cool.
It's kind of like eat your spine.
I love that.
Well, just visualize all the muscle completely surrounding. Like if you look at a cross-section of the spine or pull up an anatomy book, there's just so much meat.
So much going on in there. Yeah.
And so take advantage of all that meat rather than thinking about trying to like arch and
just
quote unquote set your back. Take a huge breath and grip your spine with everything you can, to include your lat cue. I think is like those lats, the lats are right in the mix in the upper part of your back that can also be part of grabbing the torso and setting the thoracic spine.
Yeah.
So that as I load my hands and start putting more weight onto the body and start bringing my legs into pushing, there's no slop, there's no squish, there's no power leak.
Yeah.
It's just I push the bar and it moves. And it feels so much tighter and so much more efficient. And the bar path feels shorter.
Yes.
The pole feels shorter. My hips feel like they're staying close to the bar.
Yeah. You can feel a good deadlift because it feels short. Like you just said, you're just like, whoa, I'm at the top.
Right.
And you can feel the deadlift where it's that segmented movement pattern. You use this phrase of like you're hanging off, like the deadlift's hanging off your back.
Yeah.
Which I know that feeling. The bar feels like it's inches away from you. And you're just like, oh my gosh, like how is my spine even holding?
Feel like a fishing pole
at this point. Yeah. Versus that one where it's just like everything's so compact.
Yeah.
And you go from like building the tension in your legs to standing. And it's like so satisfying.
Yeah.
I like that lat cue. I had to go back and think about it for a second. The other reason I like that is I'm trying to get away from an overextension cue, but I still want and the way that I help myself and lifters think about that is you're trying to get your shoulders as close to your hips as you can. And so instead of thinking of arching your thoracic spine or squeezing your shoulder blades together, it's more about moving your shoulders down your back towards your hips.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's hard to go into overextension while you're doing that.
Yeah.
And it's like also tough to really overextend your lower back when you do that. So it's like a lot of these ideas for cueing, like how do we get the biggest joints as close to each other as we can?
Right.
So knees out kind of helps that. The lat cue kind of helps it to move your shoulders towards your back. And then you have the hips in the middle that are just trying to get close to the bar.
Right. That makes me think of another thing I focus on a lot with my lifters that's changed. I think the first time I actually recognized it was I was working with Will Morris and Matt Reynolds on his deadlift setup. For those of you that aren't familiar with Will Morris, he has tragically short arms and amazingly long torso.
Yes.
Which, if you know anything about getting into a deadlift setup, that is an unfortunate combination. And if your mental model is for the hips to be at a certain visually relatively high position or your back angle to be at a certain position, it can be very frustrating to feel like you are just not able to get into the quote unquote right position.
Yeah.
And obviously we teach the idea of setting up with the bar roughly an inch away from your shins and over midfoot. But these are things that are generally good starting points for most people. And even then there's some wiggle room and it might change a little bit based on a lot of different variables that you just can't take into account. So one of the overarching things that I look for in the deadlift setup and initial start position is how much change is happening in the body position as the plates break off the floor, because that often can be an indication of either not setting your back or your lats or your knees in a strong enough position or being like aggressive enough in setting yourself up, or the bar could be in the wrong spot, which is another common fault, is either starting with the bar in the wrong position or throughout the set, letting the bar get out of position as you start getting fatigued or you lower the bar over your knees or something like that. There's a million different ways you can get in the wrong position. So the thing that I look for is how much is the back angle changing, or how much squish do you see coming into the lift as you're breaking the plates off the floor, and then back up from there to try to figure out what might be causing it. And my goal is recently that I actually want to set up with my hips as low as possible such that the back angle doesn't change when the plates break off the floor.
Yes.
Because if I set up too close to my shins, if the bar is too close to my shins, I will be in a straight-legged deadlift if I take it to the extreme.
Your hips are further away from the bar.
Hips are further away from the bar, knees are extended, and there's no way for me to get out of that position throughout the course of squeezing into the setup. I will be stuck in a stiff-legged deadlift. However, if I set up with my hips too low, as long as I'm patient squeezing into my setup position and I'm keeping my setup position tight, I will eventually pull into the correct position. With the one risk being that if I rush that, the bar could have momentum going backwards, or I might leave the bar off my shins if I don't stay tight. So there's some margin for error. But if you watch like the super heavyweight strongman guys, they intentionally actually start relatively low and kind of like momentum up to it and miss occasionally reps because
timing was off.
Timing's off because the bar swings off their shins, et cetera, stuff like that. But all of this long story short to say, I focus on the change as the plate's breaking off the floor as a way of identifying where there might be an inefficiency or an incorrect position.
I can't help but think of this one client. She's very strong. She's really leggy. So she has a high hip start position in a deadlift. And after our squat podcast episode that we did, and after Burgos wrote that article about everything in the squat, I started to give her a little more wiggle room on the midfoot position with the deadlift. And the reason I did that was because she would set up in what I believed was the perfect deadlift position. And one indicator that works well for literally every other client of mine is that the crease of the armpit is directly over the bar. So the back of the arm is vertical, not the arm bone itself. So I had her doing that, and she would pull, and it was just so slow at a certain time before she got to her knees that sometimes she would miss it or her back would round, and we couldn't get past that. And yet she would sometimes have reps where her hips were too low and her arm was actually vertical, and she would make the rep. And I was just like, but that's wrong. And so
when you say hips were quote unquote too low, what does that mean? Per your model,
per
mental
my perfect model.
Exactly.
And then I was like, after we gave ourselves permission to rethink what that would be like in the squat, I was like, you know what, let's just try this in her deadlift. And so I let her start with her hips a little teeny bit lower. Her arm is actually now vertical, and she can really sail past that sticking point. She's added a lot of weight to the bar.
What happened with Will Morris.
Yeah.
That was why it clicked, is that we were working with, Matt particularly was working with him, and it was like, well, let's just try a lower hip start position.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's exactly what it was. And I have found this more and more to be true, that some people's anthropometry is more conducive to a relatively lower hip start position, which, just like we talk about with the squat and how individual anthropometry will change how the squat looks, the principle is the same.
Yeah.
The principle of still being the combined center of mass over the midfoot to be able to maintain balance. And like I said, still, I bet when you made that change, her back angle wasn't changing as she broke it off the floor.
No, and like I've been watching, her hips do not get further away from the bar on the way up.
Right.
And that's what I told her the other day. I was like, this is working because your hips are not getting further away from the bar on the way up.
Right.
You're solving this problem
That's
really
another
well.
diagnostic for what I'm saying is the back angle's not changed.
Yes.
Like it's not flattening out as she loads it.
Totally.
Which connects to one other thing I wanted to mention that I really have informed my mental model, or what I think is part of the challenge with the deadlift, is that the combined center of mass, it's the only lift that we have in our core, main four, where the combined center of mass changes as you initiate the lift. So what do I mean by that? Like you said, when you put the bar on your back for a squat and walk out,
you have it.
Yes, you have it. The barbell body lifter system is a connected unit, and it shall be that way for the rest of the lift. With the deadlift, as you set up initially, bend over and grab the bar, the center of mass is only your body. And the combined center of mass is generated as you squeeze the setup, and it is not fully combined until you completely break the plates
plate is
off the floor.
Man, I hadn't thought about that, yeah.
And similar with the squat, with a 1,000-pound deadlift, the combined center of mass is essentially going to be the barbell.
Yeah.
But for most human beings that are lifting maybe 2x, 3x their body weight, the body is a huge component of that combined center of mass, especially because the butt's sticking out and it's, the hips where most of the meat is away from the bar. So the combined center of mass, as you're squeezing off the floor, is moving. And that is, I think, why squeezing the bar off the cue is such an important, or squeezing the bar off the floor is such an important cue, particularly for new lifters, because they're having to manage the changing combined center of mass and the balance that they have to maintain. In order to stay balanced, you have to keep that combined center of mass over your midfoot.
Right.
And it's changing until you finally break the plate off the floor, which is why it's impossible to pull the bar in an incorrect position, because you can't stay balanced. So you will get into the right position eventually. It's just a matter of
there's
how many other variables are there going to be.
If it's me deadlifting 95 pounds, I'm going to get away with the bar maybe being a bit far away, things being out of whack.
It'll drift into position though.
It'll eventually get where it needs to be. And that gets more and more true the heavier it gets.
Right.
Yeah.
So I guess where I'm really getting back to is similar with the squat, really being focused on balance, which, to your point, kind of at the very beginning, you can drift out of position more so with the deadlift. Like you can get heel heavy.
Bar can come away from a little bit.
Usually don't see people getting toe heavy, but like there is a little bit of tendency for people to want to use their body weight to kind of ratchet, essentially, instead of using, this is often where I think you see a lot of failed deadlifts mid-shin, is that they've rocked back onto their heels and they think they're opening their back and lifting the bar, but they're really just kind of levering the bar off the floor with their body. And then they get stuck because you can't move the bar in that position. But really keeping a full, even pressured foot, pushing into the floor, I think is a really important cue for a new lifter to focus on. So I kind of sequence, I think, squeezing into position, getting all of your levers locked into position and starting to load it up as you pry or squeeze the bar off the floor, and then maintaining an even pressure and pushing the earth away to accelerate the bar up your leg.
And to feel the weight in your feet.
Yes.
It's a good thing.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, totally.
Deadlifts, the best lift.
You shall deadlift again.
I believe I will.
Yes. Squat's coming back.
Squat's coming
Big
back.
milestone this week.
One plate.
Hey.
It's exciting.
And no pain.
And no pain. And it felt like I was very caffeinated. I had a little bit of coffee and a Celsius, which I actually didn't know that Celsius had caffeine until recently, but
Interesting.
anywho, 135 actually felt like a warm up like it used to. That's a cool moment.
Congrats.
Yeah, that's fun.
Yeah. I have recently been deadlifting regularly over kind of 440 or actually 220 kilos had been a sticking point for a long time. Like for whatever reason, I would just put 220 on and back wouldn't have it. And I'm finally regularly doing that. Just did essentially 500 pounds for 2 reps last week. So it comes back. It comes back.
Long life of lifting ahead.
Indeed.
Awesome. Well, man, I really hope your deadlift feels so good next time you get to do it. You, Andrew, and then everybody who's listening. And if you got some value out of this, let us see your deadlift. I would really love to know if one of these cues resonated with you. Throw it up on Instagram or something. Heck, send it to me in an email. Heck darn. And yeah, tag us in it. If you can, give us a review. We'd really appreciate that. And share this. That would be amazing. Any sign-off words, Andrew?
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.